Bob, good morning. How are you?
Good, Dan. Tremendous weekend at Wrigley, and I caught a glimpse of Paulie, but before he could make eye contact with me, I sort of discreetly turned my back.
Okay. Paulie, you said you saw Bob, but you said Bob didn't acknowledge you.
Dan, I'm putting that down in the win column that he recognized me. I expect to be blown off by Mr. Costas. I'm good.
What you thought the scene would be and what the scene turned out to be, Bob? Close to it?
Well, the scene on Friday night was pretty festive before the game, and then the game took some of the wind out of their sails. And then I thought that Saturday was sort of in between, and finally they had something to cheer about on Sunday, although a lot of people came to the park with some dread because they were down 3-1, bad enough to lose the World Series, but lose all 3 games at Wrigley with the prospect of the Indians celebrating on the Cubs' home field. So it was kind of strange. It wasn't as celebratory as people expected it to be, but when they poured out into the streets after Game 5, and a lot of people stayed around last night after the game to sing Go Cubs Go and send them off on their way to Cleveland, finally last night you got a little bit of that feeling.
To see Chapman come in, and you could tell there were some guys who were overmatched at the plate. But
sure.
But I don't know the last time. Have you seen a situation where somebody was that overpowering, that dominant against somebody on a big stage like this?
Well, no one's ever thrown, at least by a reliable recording, no one's ever thrown as hard as Aroldis Chapman in the history of Major League Baseball. I can think of in a different era when it wasn't as unusual for a reliever to come on in any situation and pitch this long, at least not a closer. You can remember Goose Gossage coming in, and I'm not exactly sure how hard Goose Gossage threw, somewhere in the high 90s, might have hit triple digits on a modern measuring device, but he was a frightening presence on the mound. I mean, he certainly had an intimidating aura about him. So maybe you got to go back to the 70s and early 80s for Gossage. Maybe I'm overlooking somebody. But in recent history, someone throwing that hard, that overpoweringly, that long, in that important a game, no.
How does this not work out for the Indians going back home up 3-2?
Well, because the Cubs have arrested Arrieta for Game 6, and if they get to Game 7, arrested Hendricks against Tomlin on 3 days rest, and Kluber yet again on 3 days rest, and you wonder if that ever catches up with him. And the Cubs have been in need of some offense, and they get Kyle Schwarber back as the designated hitter. So they definitely have a chance, but the simple math is this. The other team is home and needs 1 out of 2. The Cubs are on the road. They need them both.
It's Bob Costas joining us. I feel like the Indians are sort of playing the role of best supporting actor here, and I mean, unfairly, and it looks like, they have the opportunity to take home the Academy Award. Why is it that I mean, I know the Cubs story resonates, but
yeah,
the Indian story is pretty fascinating as well. Why hasn't that resonated nationally here?
I think 3 reasons. You take the Cubs out of the equation, maybe it isn't as much of a national story, but Cleveland becomes the story, not just because the Indians haven't won since 1948 and their loyal fan base has had its own share of disappointments, but it's a great story to link the Cavaliers in the spring with the Indians doubling down in the fall in a city that hadn't seen a major championship since 1964 in any sport, to get 2 of them in the space of a few months, and almost any other autumn, that would be the story. But now you got the Cubs. So, A, the Cubs have waited longer. B, I think this is part of it too. The Cubs have been a story all season long. This has been building all season long because they're not a lightning in a bottle team. They're not a fluke, and I'm not saying that Cleveland is by any means, but this has been coming. They won the division a year ago, or they got in the playoffs a year ago and then beat the Cardinals and got to the LCS. They won 103 games. So there's been anticipation building, whereas Cleveland kind of came out of the shadows and into the postseason. And then the third factor is this, again, through no fault of the current Indians team, these games are at Wrigley Field. And so all the demons and almost all the history, at least going back to 1914, only 6 years after their last championship, is in the building where these games are being played. Just like in 2004, all the history was at Fenway Park. So I think the venue makes a difference too.
Is it good for baseball if the Cubs win this?
I've heard people say that the best outcome for baseball is that it goes 7. You got a Wednesday night against only early season NBA and NHL games. And so it ought to get the best World Series rating for a single game in a generation. And I've heard people say the best outcome for baseball is that the Cubs lose Game 7. Cleveland celebrates at home. That's a great story in its own way. The curse continues, if you want to call it a curse, or the longing for a championship, however you want to view it, continues. And the Cubs, because they are built to last, they're not a fluke team. They come back and contend next year, and the story plays itself out again.
Could you see Terry Francona getting MVP votes if the Indians win?
I don't think that's allowed.
You're not allowed to have a write-in vote for the manager?
There are people that want to write in on November 8th one way or the other, too. But so maybe it's part of a trend for the week.
Yeah, I just think that Francona has been singled out as, this master manipulator with the bullpen and how he's used his guys, including Andrew Miller. I don't know how this resonates with the baseball writers themselves if the Indians happen to win this.
Well, I think if they win it in 7, Kluber's got a good chance to be the MVP. Lindor, who's a tremendous player, has distinguished himself throughout the postseason and in this World Series. What Francona is doing is adding to his near certain Hall of Fame credentials, especially if Cleveland wins the whole thing.
All right, here's one thing I'll leave you with. The All-Star game and the fact that the Cubs, who had more wins, don't open up and have home field advantage. If that is revisited with a new commissioner, and also the designated hitter, if there's any more traction of having it or not having it in baseball. I guess you're not going to get rid of that position with the money attached to it. Can you see a designated hitter in the National League down the road?
I hope not. I like the difference between the two leagues, and I like it in the World Series this way. I think it's added intrigue. Playing Schwarber in the games in Cleveland, Francona showing that he certainly could be an excellent National League manager as well, handling all the strategy there. The differences between the way the game is played in each venue, it's added a chess match aspect to it, and it's always been a big part of baseball. The conversation surrounding it during a game, the second guessing, afterwards, stuff to talk about. God knows the games are long enough. You need something to talk about. So I like that just the way it is. And the only reason I'm not outraged about the All-Star game determining who has home field advantage in the World Series is that what it replaced is just as random. Forever it was just alternating. National League's turn, American League's turn. No matter what the records of the teams were, no matter if one team led wire to wire and the other team was a wild card. It just was an alternating system. And if you replaced it with team with best record, that's one thing within a league. But let's say that some team comes out of a tremendous division that actually got the 2 wild card teams in its league, and they won 99 games. And they go up against a team that won 100 games in a weaker division, and the two never met in interleague play, so there's no way to distinguish them. Who's to say that the 100-win team really deserves home field any more than the 99-win team? That's kind of random, too, in that situation.
Safe travels to Cleveland, Bob. Great to catch up with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.